Worry, don't be happy. Worry, don't be happy.
Hi folks. One of the most interesting and I actually believe important conversations recently has become about the future of work and are jobs changing and what we should do to prepare for it. So around the Christmas table was this last Christmas, people were talking about that as well as should they buy bitcoins and if so when. And I'm sure many of us are thinking about the future and how we should prepare for it and what skills we should do to acquire. And that leads us to think, is that version of the song that just played something, is it real? Should we be worried about the future of work? Or is it actually just another of those hypes like Y2K and these big media storms that come up that will actually pass and we can carry on as before and actually be happy? So should we be worried or can we be relatively comfortable about the future of work? Well, let's look at what some of the people who've researched this are saying. It all started with some work published by two Oxford University professors, Osborne and Frey, in 2013. And they published some work which said that by 2013, 47% of American jobs will be capable of being done by computers. And the same methodology was applied in other countries around the world, and in Germany that number was 60%, and everybody got very worked up about this. Well, then the OECD came along and did their own study using a slightly different method, and they said actually that's not quite true. Only 9% of jobs will vanish, but another 26% will be significantly impacted by automation and digitalization. And then Forrester came along and said, but hang on, digitalization will actually grow jobs. It will create 7% of new jobs, but yes, it will destroy 16% of jobs, so the net impact is 9%. And then McKinsey says, well, actually up to 30% of the hours that are currently worked globally can be automated by 2030, but only 5% of professions will vanish. And the World Economic Forum says that 35% of the skills needed today won't be needed by 2020. And everybody's got their own opinion on this, which has led the economists to ask, are we ready for the future of work? Now, what's actually interesting when you look at all these predictions and all these studies is you might think there's actually no agreement on this, so therefore it's probably not real. And my sense is that whilst there is no consensus on the actual numbers of jobs that will be displaced and the exact jobs that will be displaced, there is absolute consensus that the nature of work will change and the workplace will change fundamentally. So therefore, perhaps, that version of the song that says we should perhaps be a little bit concerned about this is the one we should think about. Now, I think it's important when we're thinking about the future always to anchor it in a sort of a backward look at the past. So let's take a lightning tour through the history of work. And modern humanity evolved about 250,000 years ago. And since then, essentially, we've had the same capacity as human beings, the same mental and cognitive capacity. But up until about 8,000 years ago, work was being hunter-gatherers. Hunting, storing the food, foraging, that was the nature of work. And then in about 9,000 BC, we learned to plant crops and domesticate animals. And the agrarian age began, and for about 10,000 years, from 8,000 BC till almost a few hundred years ago, the world was an agrarian society, and work consisted of planting crops, managing our animals, and managing the produce, and a bit of trade around those. So that was the nature of work. What people often forget, by the way, in all these histories of work is that knowledge work is not essentially a new thing. So throughout the ages, we've had people who have been elite and have had special skills in terms of being able to read and write, but it was really limited to a few scholars of the age and the wise men of the society, and it wasn't a generally distributed capability. But then a critical thing happened in the late 1400s with the invention of the Gothenburg press, and that essentially democratized reading and writing. It therefore democratized knowledge, and with that it gave rise to the industrial age. And the industrial age in its three phases: steam-powered work, electrically powered work, and production lines and mass production. And that came along and that sort of dominated the nature of work from about 1700 through to the 1900s. And throughout this period of the Industrial Revolution, the service industries which supported them, whether it was traders or the support professional services, they grew, not to the extent that they are now, but the service industries supporting them grew and grew. And it's got to the point now where we've got precision manufacturing and computer-assisted knowledge work. And essentially that's where we have got up to until very recently. So I think the point is, if we look at that history, people will say, but hang on, there have been these disruptions to work through the ages. We had hunter-gatherers becoming farmers, we had farmers becoming industrial age workers, we had the dawn of knowledge work, we had the steam revolution. People said steam would put people out of work, it didn't. People said production lines would reduce the amount of work, they didn't. In fact, people said computers would reduce the amount of work needing to be done by people, but in fact it hasn't. It's increased the amount of work needing to be done by people. And indeed, throughout the ages, particularly through the Industrial Revolution, we've actually seen a growth in jobs. We've seen net employment as a percentage of population grow around the world. So that leads us to the question, if there's been these disruptions to work over the ages, is it different this time? Is this just another of those disruptions and we'll get by? So what is different this time? And I think what's different this time is the rate of change. Whereas in the past, these huge transformations came every 1,000 years or every 100 years, or at least every few generations. Change is coming at us now in waves of 5 years and 3 years and 2 years. And human beings are incredibly adaptive, resilient creatures, and we can adapt to all sorts of change and the biggest changes in our environment that you can imagine. But the point is, we do take a generation or two to respond. We take a generation or two at least for our core value systems and the way we think about social institutions to change. We also take a generation or two for new skill sets to be embedded across society, not just in one or two people. You and I and some people might learn a new particular skill in a few years. We can learn a new language in 1 year. But for a society to change its skill base, it takes a generation or two. And therefore the ability of society to adapt to fundamental technology transformations, which are coming at us at the space of 2 or 3 years apart, is really limited. And it's like being in the ocean with a big swell, and just as you come up for air from the one wave, you're knocked down by the next one. So I do think this revolution is a little bit different. And it is something that we need to think about how we respond as a society, as business, and as individuals. Before we talk about how we respond, let's think a little bit about what the future of work will look like. Now, the future of jobs for a good few years to come, a decade or two at least, human beings will be at the top of the pile. People in genuinely creative roles, or people in genuine leadership roles, or people with what I call personal brands and celebrity, will sit comfortably at the top of the pile of the future of work. But a lot of what we call knowledge work today will be done by computers. The vast majority of those computers will be in big data centers. We'll never see them, we'll never hear them, we'll never even particularly know about them, churning and crunching huge amounts of data. There will be some of the jobs that are more appropriately done by humanoid computers, because there is that relational dynamic with human beings. So service industry related automation will often be behind the face of a humanoid. So routine knowledge work, fact-heavy analysis and diagnosis, or the production of knowledge work, general computation that we now use people to do, will be done by computers. There will, however, be a significant layer of work, let's call it that, which computers find particularly difficult to get right just now. So jobs and tasks that are heavy in 3 core competencies, computers are still struggling with. The first is creative intelligence. Roles that are truly creative, computers are struggling to get right. The second is roles that are strong in relational or emotional intelligence and the ability to interact at a human level with someone else. Computers still struggle to get that right. And the third category of job that computers are struggling with is complex, unstructured dexterity. So roles that are high in those 3 attributes, creative intelligence, emotional intelligence, unstructured dexterity, which really means artisanal work, there's still a good future for roles that are heavy in those. But because most of this routine and what is now manual work will be done by machines in the future, the people doing that, a lot of them will be displaced into lesser paid service work, or even worse, into no work at all. And that really is the concern. which goes back to the song at the beginning, which says, perhaps we need to be concerned about this future of work. We shouldn't be entirely comfortable. Now, depending on where we see ourselves in this pyramid of the future of work, we can be somewhat comfortable and excited about the future. Or, on the other hand, we can be very concerned and a bit worried. And it depends on our own agility and the own skills we have and how ready we are for this turbulent ride into the future of work, which in a great measure will determine whether we end up at the bottom of the pyramid or near the top. So the question then has to be, how do we prepare for this? How do we ensure that this wave that's coming isn't something we have to run from and be frightened of? Rather, it is this enormous wave. But if we have the skills and the courage to actually ride this wave, we can actually be in a really good position. And we can actually protect our futures and the futures of those around us. And this applies at a society level, at a business level, and at an individual level. So let's talk about those three levels. What as society do we need to do to prepare for this future? And there's a whole range of things that we really need to do. But the two I'd like to highlight, the first is we absolutely have to address the reality that in that future of work that I sketched, where there will unavoidably be a lot of people nearer the bottom of the pyramid than the top, we do need to recognize that we're going to see a continued growth in inequality. The world is likely to become a more unequal place unless we find the right social mechanisms to deal with that, the right social and political mechanisms. Very respectable economists, formerly conservative countries, are actually talking about universal wages. That might not be the answer, but the reality of a tendency or trend towards growing inequality is real, and to the extent that it will be not sustainable. So the question we firstly need to address as a society is have a very real conversation about how we deal with inequality. The second one, and this is particularly important, I guess, for me in a university context, is we need to think about what and how we teach and learn. The graphic here shows a sort of a Victorian age classroom. And at its core, the way we teach and what we teach hasn't actually changed much in 200 or 300 years. We still teach basic skills and basic knowledge, and it's about learning knowledge and facts and the ability to do certain skills. And that hasn't really changed. Now, I'm not suggesting that basic skills and the social dynamic of the education system is unimportant, but we need to supplement it with something that we can become a whole lot more agile and teach the core capabilities which are more relevant for the future than a simple STEM education. A pure STEM education is really important. It is a necessary but perhaps not sufficient condition to thrive in the future. So as society, those are at least two of the questions we need to really address and have a meaningful discourse around. There's many others, but those are the two I'd like to highlight. So then, at the level of responsible business, how should we respond? What is it that we as responsible businesses need to do to prepare for this future and to help our workforces prepare? I think the first thing we need to do is we need to transform our businesses. Because if we don't transform our businesses, they will go out of business, which isn't going to help anybody, least of all our employees. So we do need to fundamentally transform our businesses from our business model, our core value proposition, the way we engage with customers, the way we transform our core processes, operations, the usual issues of business transformation and digital transformation. We have to succeed at those to ensure that our businesses have an exciting, viable future. The second thing we need to think about is how do we transform the workplace? You see here in the image sort of a 1950s office, and that was appropriate for that time. But how do we transform the workplace now to recognize mobility, to recognize the different social contract between the employer and the employee, to recognize that what we do and how we offer it to customers is fundamentally changed. So the transformation of the workplace is something that we as businesses need to do to make sure that it is fit for purpose for the employee of the future as well as the business of the future. And then the third thing we need to help do is transform the workforce. And our role here as business really is to empower our people to transform themselves. People ultimately need to transform themselves, but we as business need to provide the right context, the right environment, the right platforms which empower them and enable them to transform themselves. And then we start thinking about it as individuals. So what do we as individuals need to do? What is my response to this changing nature of work? And I was asked by a journalist to put together a 10-point plan, or 10 tips to deal with the future of work. So here goes. These are 10 tips. The first is beware of predictions. I've made a lot of predictions. And the fact is, technology change and all change happens in fits and starts. It's an uneven process. Some of the predictions we talk about will happen. Some of them won't happen. So whilst it's really, really important to be aware of the future and to plan for the future, it's equally important to live in the present. It is equally important to do now and still do good business, acquire the skills now, because ultimately, if we neglect the present, the future for us might never arrive, or certainly not in the way that we want. So beware of predictions, plan for the future, but live in the present. The second really critical thing is learning how to learn. I touched on it when I spoke about changing what we learn and how we learn as society. It is really important to acquire skills, but it's almost it's about what we are certain about is change. We know tomorrow will be different from today, and the day after that will be different from tomorrow. So the ability to learn, the ability to reinvent ourselves, not once, but again and again, is probably the most important capability or attribute that will be needed by people to stay relevant and successful in the future. A third thing flowing from the ability to learn and how to learn is recognizing that behaviors and capabilities are perhaps even more important than specific skills. And in fact, quite a lot of the so-called old-fashioned attributes that made people successful remain as relevant today as they were 10 years ago, as they were 30 years ago, probably as they were 100 years ago. So those things are things like the ability to communicate well, being a team player, perseverance and determination, critical thinking, the ability to question things from different angles. These are more capabilities or behaviors than they are specific skills. But when you speak to HR managers around the world, when you speak to leaders in top companies, these are the things they value more than the fact that this person knows Python or this person knows R or this person is a great actuary. So core capabilities are something that we need to nurture in ourselves. Having said that, skills do matter. So let's acquire those skills that are relevant to today. And in particular, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, the so-called STEM skills. They are certainly going to be really important for the next decade. They're underrepresented in the marketplace at the moment, and they're growing in importance. So to the extent that we can enhance our own STEM skills, we're enhancing our own opportunities in this future of work. Now, I know some people find maths and technology and engineering boring and dull or difficult, but they are critical skills, and to the extent that we can put those into our own personal repertoires, we are enhancing our value and creating ourselves options for a diversity of opportunities, which I'm going to come back to. A fifth thing we can do is get tech savvy. And it sounds quite trivial, but at the moment, there's so many productivity tools and effectiveness tools out there that we don't really know how to use. And I believe this applies as much to old timers like myself, who don't necessarily know how to use all the new social media platforms and social media tools and cloud-based tools at our disposal, but even to the millennials who perhaps aren't power users of Excel and Microsoft and PowerPoint, which are fundamental productivity tools at the moment. And to the extent that we can use these tools and the other similar tools available, we are enhancing our productivity. They've got to become background, that we don't have to think about them. They've got to become second nature, that we can focus on the more difficult stuff, which is about complex problem solving, critical thinking, communicating effectively, working in teams, that we don't have to think about the tools and spend half our intellectual capacity getting the basics right. Another important thing is diversifying our skills and our opportunities, and indeed, therefore, our careers. Some observers and independent thinkers are increasingly saying having a full-time job as your job is almost like taking your entire investment and putting it in one stock. And that's a really high risk thing to do. It can work really well, but if that stock goes bust, you are left with no wealth left. So what we need to do is diversify our careers, that we have a wider diversity of opportunity and indeed a bit of risk management. That the so-called gig economy, that we do a bit of this and a bit of that. It is, of course, in a balancing act, because you do also want to be fully committed to and determined to succeed in those things that you do take on. What is really important throughout all of this, and whatever we do, is that we do work that we find meaningful. Now, my meaningful might be different to your meaningful, but research has shown again and again and again that people can put up with all sorts of hardship and all sorts of disappointment and manage all sorts of risk if the work that they are doing is meaningful to them. So even if you perceive your career or your current job as being undervalued or potentially high risk, or you're not sure where it's going in the long term, if your work is meaningful to you, it actually counts for a huge amount. So whatever we choose to do, don't fritter yourself, don't fritter away your hours on work that you find frivolous and meaningless. And then in the digital world, there's a huge opportunity for us to fritter away our time on trivia and meaningless work. It is really important for all of us that we find something to do that is meaningful to us. I think another point that is important for us to be aware of is understanding future demand. I touched on it in the pyramid of work. At the top of the pyramid, there'll be the highly creative roles and people in genuine leadership positions. Enhance our leadership skills. If we have a creative side, nurture it, nourish it. But then there was that layer in the middle which spoke about creative intelligence, emotional intelligence, manual dexterity and artisanal work. Let's be aware of those and also start building our skills and our own competencies in our ability to engage with people at an emotional level. So I mentioned roles that are rich in creative intelligence, relational intelligence, and manual dexterity. And on the creative side, the ability to nurture those creative skills. And it's not just for the far out artists amongst us, because complex problem solving and critical thinking are almost the flip side of the coin of creativity. If you want to solve a very complex problem, an element of creativity is intrinsic to that process. So nurture the creative skills that you have. That brings me to another really important point. We are human beings. We think, we have emotions, we feel, we love, we cry, we laugh, we experience joy, we experience disappointment. And our ability to talk to other people as human beings, particularly in leadership roles, people follow people. They might obey a machine, but they follow people. We engage with people. And at the moment, customers around the world are still people who make decisions on the basis of how they feel more than what they know. So for us, it's really important that we need to recognize that we are not machines. Let's not try to be machines. We are human beings, and let's play to the strengths of being human beings. Let's celebrate our humanity. Let's celebrate the fact that we are imperfect, that we are emotional, and make that a strength rather than a weakness. What is important also as this journey unfolds is that it is really important to be heard. That we have to be part of the conversation. We can't just be victims and go along for this ride and say, oh, this digital wave is washing over us. Woe is me, what am I going to do? Or to complain as societies move in a direction and don't respond as we would like. We need to be part of the conversation. This whole digital world is exposing new frontiers in ethics and policy and governance and how we should respond. I mentioned, for example, how we deal with inequality. We need to be part of that conversation. We need to make our voices heard in terms of how our society should respond, how our businesses should respond, because we are not just victims in this. We do have the ability to shape. I don't believe in technological determinism that says, this wave of technology will happen and humanity are just passengers along for the ride. We need to shape this. We need to actually be in charge, and all voices are important, including our own. And then finally, of course, beware of any 10-point plan. This is simply a checklist. It is a thought jogger. I've probably left out another 10 points that are equally important. What is important is to think about this, to become engaged, to actually read, to equip ourselves with knowledge and understanding and insight. So hopefully these 10 points are helpful. I certainly wouldn't put them up as being the ultimate recipe for success in this future world of work. I'd like to finish with an illustration which almost goes back to my first and second points of my sort of 10 tips about how to succeed. And it is about the fact that, yes, some things change dramatically and we have to equip ourselves with skills. But on the other hand, the more some things change, the more others stay the same. And the question I'd like to ask you is who these people are. And I'd be very impressed if you knew more than half of them by their faces. And what do they have in common? Well, the first thing they have in common, unfortunately, of course, is they're all male, which we need to make a plan about. The second thing they have in common is they're all exceedingly wealthy. Shame, this guy here doesn't have a net worth to the same extent, but he only earned about $100 million in 2016. So they're all exceedingly wealthy. The number, by the way, on the screen is their net wealth in billions of US dollars. The third thing they all have in common is they are or were the chief executive officer of tech icon companies at the time which they really rose to prominence and global dominance. But what's interesting about them is the fourth thing they all have in common, with the exception of two, and it is important to recognize the exceptions, is that they're all sort of 50 plus. The exceptions, of course, being Ma Huateng from Tencent and Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook, who are relatively young. Now, why do I show this? And I show this because I believe that success in the future does depend on some of those old-fashioned attributes: hard work, the ability to create visions, translate visions into strategy, translate strategy into execution plans, know how to measure the performance against those execution plans and hold ourselves accountable, and actually then feed that back and continuously improve ourselves. These old-fashioned skills also have teamwork and determination and hard work. They're as relevant today as they were 10 years ago and 30 years ago. And that is, I think, what these leaders brought to the table. But what they also brought to the table was an unshakable vision in the future, and the power of that vision, and the belief that that vision was the right one for them and their organizations, and the skills and the new capabilities in themselves and their businesses, which made that vision a reality. And I think it's the same with us when we think about the future of work. We need to have a vision for what this future of work looks like, where we see ourselves as businesses and as individuals in that. We need the courage to actually grasp this and do new things and learn new skills and acquire new capabilities. But recognize that the platform on which it's all built is some of those old-fashioned attributes, like hard work, the ability to work well with other people, to communicate, to solve complex problems, to think critically about things. And I believe if we can get that balance right about treasuring the old and acquiring new skills and capabilities, this future of work doesn't have to be something which we need to be worried about. And to finish off with the words of the song, perhaps we can be a little bit less unhappy and a bit more comfortable, and we don't need to worry. So the question then is, so what is WITS doing, to wrap up? What is WITS Business School doing? So we've created the WITS Digital Chair in Business, and we're providing a range of learning programs, which in the digital space specifically, we have a master's program, which is a master's in digital business, supported by a postgraduate diploma in digital business, supported by a whole lot of online learning programs and short courses, supported by executive education programs, both in a paid corporate sense as well as open systems. And then we're also getting a research program going which says, let's talk about this future. Let's talk about future business models, processes, and practices. Let's talk about the socio-economic impact of digitalization and do research into that. Let's look at applications of digitalization in mining and healthcare and learning and commerce and fintech and retail. And let's also research these, what are appropriate governance and policy and ethical frameworks that were perhaps not exposed or relevant 10 years ago, that will become increasingly critical to get our heads around 10 years from now. So these are the research areas we're working on. So what I'm saying is the future is definitely big change, and more than one big change. It will be change after change after change, coming at us in waves of 1 and 2 and 3 years apart, not 5 and 10 and 20 years apart. But if we equip ourselves for the future, we certainly can push the on button and thrive and succeed in this future world of work. Thank you very much.